This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Vermont has a citizen legislature. State representatives and senators work part-time in Montpelier, January through May or June. That means most lawmakers have other forms of income. Maybe they have another employer that lets them work part-time during the legislative session. Maybe their spouse works, or they're landlords, or they have lucrative investments in the stock market. There are pros and cons to a citizen legislature. One of the tricky situations that it creates is around conflicts of interest. This past session, for example, lawmakers spent months honing this sweeping education reform bill. I'm guessing you've heard about it. Two of the legislators who worked on it have close ties to local independent schools. That led a South Royalton resident to file an ethics complaint against them. He claimed they had a conflict of interest. Later in the show, we're going to zoom out and look at the process for ethics complaints in the state legislature. But first, we're joined from Montpelier by Vermont Public's education reporter, Lola Duffort. She's been closely following the education reform bill and the lawmakers who have played a key role in its development. Lola, welcome.
Hi, Michaela. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. So let's set the stage here by kind of summarizing this education reform bill. And I know it's massive, so we'll only focus on the part that involves this ethics complaint that we'll be discussing today. So state legislators have spent so much of the past legislative session working on this bill. And part of it involves the state's town tuitioning system. What is tuitioning?
Yeah, so in certain parts of the state, particularly the southern part of the state and the northeastern part of the state, the Northeast Kingdom, you have a lot of school districts that do not actually operate schools. So you have a school board, but there's no public school. And in that case, what will often happen is the school district will pay tuition to a family the school of a family's choice, and often those schools are private, or as we call them in Vermont, they're independent schools. This is basically a type of voucher, and it's an old tradition in Vermont. Yeah. Sorry.
So that's tuitioning. The state is paying independent schools so that a child can go there because there isn't a public school in their area. And then this past session, this ethics complaint arose involving two senators that have some ties to independent schools. Can you tell us a little bit about those senators and those ties?
Yeah, so we're talking about Senators Seth Bongartz and Scott Beck. Seth Bongartz is a Democrat. He is the chair of the Senate Education Committee. Scott Beck is a Republican, and he is the Senate Minority Leader. As those titles indicate, they are important and influential lawmakers, and they really played a key role in crafting this really high-stakes piece of legislation. They also happen to have some very public and proud ties to independent schools. Scott Beck is a teacher at St. Johnsbury Academy in St. Johnsbury, and Seth Bongartz was the longtime chair of the Board of Trustees over at Burton in Manchester. And Senator Bongartz has also done some consulting work with another private school in Manchester. And so given their ties to independent schools, a South Royalton resident who's also part of this public education advocacy group that's been very critical of choice in Vermont and of this piece of legislation, filed this ethics complaint basically saying you can't have these sorts of ties to independent schools and then be and then get to craft such a high stakes bill that has a kind of direct financial impact on these institutions.
And what do we know about the rules here? I mean, I imagine that there are rules laid out in both the House and the Senate that tell lawmakers when they are expected to recuse themselves from working on legislation in which they might have a conflict of interest. Is that true?
Yeah, there's guidance, and basically what that guidance says is that unless you have a, quote, direct and immediate interest in what you are voting on, you don't really have to recuse yourself. You're not. In fact, you're expected to vote on the matter because your role as a lawmaker is, your job, your primary responsibility is to weigh in on these affairs, right? You're in Montpelier to vote on things, to craft legislation, and to represent your communities. And so in the Senate ethics guidance, it makes pretty clear that, even if a piece of legislation would impact you materially, financially, if it also impacts a broader group of people, if you're not kind of uniquely impacted by this legislation, then you should vote on it. Often what this means is that you can be impacted by a piece of legislation and also be expected to weigh in. And often, actually, people that work in a particular sector are selected for committees that craft legislation in those sectors because the assumption is they'll have more expertise.
Direct and immediate interest is the phrase that you used. I can imagine that's pretty easily up for debate. I mean, does immediate interest mean your job depends on this school existing into the future? Does it mean that you're going to get some sort of financial benefit? It's a little squishy, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty squishy, but it is intended to be interpreted incredibly narrowly, right? And so the idea, like the Senate ethics guidance, for example, explicitly says teachers should be able to work on education bills. Farmers should be able to work on agricultural policy. Social workers should be expected to be able to vote on human services legislation, right? And so, if you vote on an education bill that's going to increase or decrease funding to the public education system and you're a teacher, that could very well impact you directly, but the assumption is if it also impacts a much larger group of people, i.e. all teachers and students, then you don't have to – you're actually expected not to recuse yourself. And so I don't know if recusal has ever happened. Probably it has at some point, but I've never seen it happen, right? Because
You've never seen it happen. That seems significant.
I've never seen it happen, which is not to say it's never happened, but it is extraordinarily rare because the standard, which I don't know, maybe is impossible to achieve, is that basically a piece of legislation has to really uniquely impact you specifically, and not also a broader group of people. And legislation usually impacts a broad group of people, right? We don't pass a lot of bills for just one business, for example.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And part of the issue here does seem to be with the underpinnings of the citizen legislature that Vermont has created for itself. I mean, being a state lawmaker is very much a part-time job. And if you're not retired and serving in the legislature, you're more than likely working another job to supplement your income from the state, right?
Yes. We see this again and again. And, sometimes it feels uncomfortable. But, if you are serving in the legislature, you either have to be independently wealthy, retired, or have another job because it pays, I think, about $15,000 a year. That's obviously not a living wage anywhere, and especially in Vermont. You often get lawmakers who have whose jobs are deeply intertwined with the legislation that they are crafting. Often you see someone who has been in the advocacy space, right, and has literally lobbied on a certain topic, and then becomes elected to the legislature and is voting on matters that are tied to what they once lobbied for. That's really common. That happens a lot.
So what comes next for this ethics complaint that was filed against Senators Bongartz and Beck? What's the process?
Well, it goes to the Senate Ethics Panel and the Senate Ethics Panel is a group of 5 senators, right? So they're basically judged by a panel of their peers. Their proceedings are not public, and neither are their decisions. In fact, complaints themselves are not public unless the complainant decides to share that complaint publicly, which is how we had heard about this one. And so it's hard to tell you what's going to come next because the process is a total black box.
And we'll be talking about that process more later in the hour with legislators who serve on both the House and Senate ethics panels. Lastly, Lola, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, the person who filed this ethics complaint is a member of an advocacy group called Friends of Vermont Public Education. And it seems to highlight, whether or not this was the intent, but this case seems to highlight the intense acrimony that we saw this past legislative session and for years prior between these kind of two camps in the education reform space, those who are advocating for independent schools and their role in the state's education system and want them to continue to receive those state tuitioning dollars, and those who believe that money is kind of being taken away from the public school system. I'm wondering if you could speak to us a little bit more here about that conflict and sort of where we're heading next now that this education reform bill has passed.
Wow. Where we are heading next is a big question. But I guess could you elaborate a little bit? Could you restate the question?
Sure. So this big education reform bill passed. There's all this acrimony between these two sides. I mean, we heard about it in conversations on Vermont Edition again
Absolutely.
and again. It was always a thing that got lots of callers calling into our show when we talk about state tuitioning. And I guess my question is, like, does this education reform bill, does that end the debate here? Like, do we have a path for the future when it comes to tuitioning, or are there still things that are up for debate?
Yeah, there certainly are things that are up for debate. This bill passed, it is now law. But basically, this law that's been passed is sort of the first half of reform. And the big thing that still needs to be worked out is sort of what new school districts will look like in this new reformed reality. Mm-hmm. And indeed, if lawmakers do not decide on new districts, a lot of what's in this bill dies, including the funding overhaul. And so, you asked me what town tuitioning is. So right now we have school districts, and legally their reason for existence is to write these checks, is to issue vouchers, right? And so their boundaries matter a ton because their boundaries determine where town tuitioning, where school choice exists. And so we are going to be carrying over this incredibly contentious debate over into next year. And frankly, whether or not it is settled is what will determine whether or not we even have education reform. One thing that is interesting, though, is that there is one part of this bill that is not contingent on anything else moving forward. And it is the fact that new kind of guardrails have been put into place about which private schools will remain eligible for public funding. And this bill actually reduces that number. And so even if all of this goes away, if redistricting never happens and therefore a new funding formula never happens, the universe of independent schools that remain eligible for public funding is shrinking. And I think that's a part of this that I think has escaped attention despite all of the conversation, anxiety, debate that we have seen about the topic of tuitioning in this very contentious debate.
Well, we're grateful we have you paying attention to these issues for us, Lola. Vermont Public education reporter Lola Duffort, thank you so much for your time today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
If you're curious about how the ethics process works in Vermont state government, that is the subject of our show the rest of this hour. Maybe you wonder how lawmakers are held accountable once they're in office, or you're concerned about conflicts of interest or corruption in the state house. You can join the conversation. Give us a call with your thoughts or your questions to 800-639-2211. You can also send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. We'll be joined in just a moment by the head of Vermont's Ethics Commission. Stay with us.
Thanks for listening to Vermont Edition, where support comes from Wendell's Furniture, home of wendellsdeals.com, offering furniture designed for a range of budgets, in stock and ready for summer. wendellsdeals.com. And Vermont Construction's Roofing Division, offering roof installation and repair with free estimates on asphalt and standing seam metal roofs. Now serving all of Vermont and northern New York. More at vtroofing.com.
Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Today on the show, we're looking into what happens when there's an ethics complaint levied against a state legislator in Vermont. The complaint could involve anything from a conflict of interest to alleged corruption. We just heard about a recent complaint involving two state senators who have close ties to independent schools. They were also involved in the education reform package that passed this session. You can join our conversation as well. Do you worry about corruption in state government? Or do you trust the electoral process and the processes in place in the State House in Montpelier? Give us a call at 800-639-2211 or send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Our next guest is the Executive Director of the Vermont Ethics Commission, Christina Sivret. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Christina, first, excuse the basic question here, but it is admittedly a little complicated to keep track of all these different oversight bodies that exist in our state government. I mean, in a bit, we're going to hear from state legislators who are on the Senate Ethics Panel and the House Ethics Committee. You're from the Vermont Ethics Commission. How is that different? What do you all do, and who's on the commission?
Sure. So the Vermont State Ethics Commission was set up in 2017 or 2018 after Vermont received very low scores nationally when it came to our government accountability framework, accountability framework. And so the Ethics Commission is actually a very small group. So you have one part-time executive director, and that's me, one part-time administrative assistant, and then we have 6 commissioners who are representatives. They're chosen by different, groups in the state. So we have one member that's appointed by the Senate Committee and Committees. We have, another member who's appointed by the League of Women Voters and community organizations. And so our role has been changing over time. When the Ethics Commission was first set up, we didn't have any real powers. There was not even a uniform state code of ethics in place. That did not happen until 2022. And so we're talking about oversight. There is actually no real independent ethics oversight in Vermont. If we're talking about, a third-party entity that is overseeing, state government or municipal government, what our organization does is we primarily provide advice and guidance to state public servants who are seeking advice when it comes to the state code of ethics. We can also accept complaints and refer them on to other entities to investigate. And we also give training. And we do that for state public servants and municipal public servants as well, certain categories of municipal public servants.
How often do you receive complaints? Have you received any in the past year, for example?
Oh, yeah, sure. So in the past year, we've received several dozen complaints,
Several
both
dozen.
municipal and at the state level. Yes, yes.
Wow. Okay, and again, you
And
work at
that's
both the
those are
municipal and state level. That's an important distinction.
Yeah, yeah. So we have different categories of complaints. So we have complaint inquiries where somebody's interested in filing a complaint, but it doesn't move forward for one reason or another. And then we have people who file formal written complaints that we refer on to other entities. And so I'd say so far this year, over 70 if we combine those two categories of complaint inquiries and formal complaints filed.
So, as you mentioned, Vermont got a pretty bad grade in ethics enforcement from the Center for Public Integrity in 2015, so 10 years ago. You've mentioned some of the changes that have occurred since then, including the creation of the commission that you head up. What are some other ways in which the legislature, the state at large, has improved its government accountability and transparency since 2015?
Sure. So the first step was in 2022 when the state adopted a state code of ethics that applies to all public servants serving in state government. So that includes legislators, it includes state employees, it includes members of certain or most boards and commissions. From there, we moved forward last year, not this most recent legislative session, but last year took giant steps forward. We expanded financial disclosure requirements for candidates and executive officers. We established a municipal code of ethics that applies to certain categories of municipal officials. So it's really tracking the state code of ethics, but expanding the reach of having a uniform code of ethics that applies to everyone. And then also legislation was passed last year to give the Ethics Commission hearing and investigatory powers over state public servants only. Those were due to go into effect this coming September, but this most recent legislative session, the legislature decided to delay those for another 2 years.
Why?
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer to that.
All right.
To be honest, it was a bit perplexing because we feel like ethics is something that's really part of the national conversation right now. And we feel like the people of Vermont, it's something that they're really tracking and concerned about at the national level. So we've kind of been hoping that Vermont was going to set, a more positive example, but it seems like this past legislative session, things started rolling back instead of moving forward or continuing to move forward.
Well, we have some state legislators. I keep mixing up those two words today. They are joining us at the end of today's show, so perhaps we'll ask them about just that. Let's go to the phones here. We have Ben calling in. Ben Kingsley is with the Campaign for Vermont. Ben, I know your organization works on ethics oversight. What are your thoughts listening to this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for allowing me to speak with you guys. I think, I was involved in the original passage of the 2017 ethics bill that created the Ethics Commission and led a coalition to do so. And I think, what Vermonters really, want to know, generally speaking, around this topic is that legislators and lawmakers are putting the public interest ahead of their own personal interest. And, most states have figured out mechanisms to do that. And, in a lot of ways, Vermont, even though we've made some progress, is still lagging behind on that front.
While I have you on the line, could I get our guest, Christina Sivret's thoughts on that? What's your opinion there?
Yeah, so Vermont is really starting from a place where we're well behind most other states, certainly behind the other states where we would want to be following their example. We have some really good examples in New England. Rhode Island is one of the states that sets kind of a gold standard for their government ethics accountability framework. But most states started working on the issues that we're just starting to work on now in the 1970s after Watergate. And so we're really playing a lot of catch up here. We made a lot of progress in the last few years, and we're really hoping that progress continues instead of stalls.
Ben, what other types of progress would you like to see occur in Vermont when it comes to ethics oversight?
That's a great question. And I think, the main one is the hearing and investigatory powers that were delayed. I think that's important. 43 other states have figured out, how to provide full independent oversight over the legislative and executive branches of state government. And that includes, investigatory powers, hearing powers, and in most cases, full enforcement powers as well. Vermont may not be ready to go quite that far, but I think those are important, and they provide clarity for the process because, Vermonters want a place to go when they have a concern. And they want to make sure that those concerns are taken seriously. And today, when those concerns are raised, they're forwarded to, House and Senate ethics panels that are run by the peers of the folks that they're complaining about. And that does not feel like a confidence-inspiring process.
Ben Kingsley with the Campaign for Vermont, thank you for calling in. Let's go next to Bill in Manchester. Bill, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thanks for taking the call.
Sure.
First, a comment, and then a general question, I guess, is I think these charges are against these two legislators who had an investment in quality education and maybe a different style of education is somewhat bogus. I mean, the argument of taking money away from other students in the state, I don't understand where that's coming from. These schools receive the same state amount for each student, and they comply with all the other standards and act like public schools and providing all the education that and the styles of education and deal with all the students that every public school has to deal with. So I just don't understand why they have to file the issue. But the larger question is that everybody in our legislature has some outside interest, some personal interest, some former career where that is eventually affected by legislation. And I think, deprive these legislators of not being able to speak up for and speak about their areas where they are experienced and have can contribute probably substantial judgment to these issues is inappropriate and going down the wrong road. Because the bottom line is they are only one vote of roughly 30 in the Senate, I believe, and 150 in the House.
Yeah, Bill, let me pose your point to our guest now, Christina Sivret with the Vermont Ethics Commission. And I hear you that, it seems like every single state legislator is going to have some sort of personal or professional tie that could seem to be a conflict of interest, but phrased another way, it could be a type of expertise that would help them do their job in Montpelier. Christina, I wonder if you could address this concern, this confusion. I imagine lots of folks share that Bill is talking about right now. How do we get legislators to talk about their conflicts of interest without dissuading them from revealing those potential conflicts or using their personal expertise while in the State House?
Yes, well, so the Ethics Commission is prevented really from speaking about specific situations, and I should kind of back up a bit and just explain that. So we have a uniform state code of ethics that applies to everyone. However, there are certain exemptions, there are limited exemptions, but core legislative functions as applied to legislators are something that are exempt from the state code of ethics. So when it comes to conflict of interest, they actually have a different standard for a conflict of interest than what is laid out in the state code of ethics. So from our perspective, it's a little bit difficult to weigh in on the legislative situation just because they're operating on their own separate standards. I will say, generally speaking, when we look at conflicts of interest, there's two ways to look at it. I'm talking specifically about the state code of ethics that apply to everyone. You look at it number one is something technically allowed under the state code of ethics. Could you do this? There's an argument that this is okay. And then the second part of the equation, when we're advising people, we say, is is taking this course of action something that will promote public trust in government? So there's kind of the two different ways to look at it. One is the official kind of framework, is this allowable? And then there's a kind of common sense perspective. But again, I can't speak specifically to what's happening in the legislature because there's a set of standards when it comes to core legislative functions, which means committee assignments and voting. Those are a separate set of standards.
Well, lastly, Christina, I wonder if you could weigh in for us on the closed-door nature of ethics deliberations as they exist in the state legislature right now. Does that closed-door nature make sense to you, have merit?
Yeah, again, so I can't really comment on procedures that are happening outside of our office. I'll say when we get hearing and investigatory powers, there's, something that's laid out in the statute that talks about when we can discuss issues. And so, for example, when we are able to actually hold hearings and investigate complaints, the time when information will become public is when we've made findings. And at that point, a certain amount of information will be made public. But again, that's something that's laid out in statute. I think that generally speaking, when there's a lack of transparency, that does create a lack of, trust in the process and, trust in government. So the greater amount of transparency that is allowed, the better when it comes to, I think, public expectations and creating public trust.
Christina Sivret is the executive director of the Vermont State Ethics Commission. Christina, thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, thank you.
Coming up, members of both the House and Senate ethics committees are going to share their perspectives on the ethics process in our state government. That's coming up soon. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us, we are learning more about the ethics process in Vermont's state legislature. What happens when there's an ethics complaint levied against a senator or representative? The complaint could involve anything from a conflict of interest to alleged corruption. Joining me now are two state legislators involved in this ethics process. Senator Tanya Vyhovsky is a progressive Democrat representing the Chittenden Central Senate District. She's a member of the Senate Ethics Panel and the Government Operations Committee. Senator, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by Representative Martin LaLonde. He's a Democrat representing South Burlington, the chair of the House Ethics Committee and the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. Representative, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Oh, we're glad to have you both. To start broad here, when you both were first elected to your positions, did Vermont's ethics process meet your expectations, underwhelm you, or surprise you with its thoroughness? Senator?
I would say that it wasn't something I gave a lot of thought to before getting elected, but certainly as I learned more about it, I was surprised and underwhelmed. I started in 2021, so was part of that 2022 process of sort of looking at creating a statewide ethics code, and was underwhelmed even by what we did, and was shocked that we were one of few states that didn't even have one.
And Representative?
There were things I liked about the ethics panel and the work that they were doing, and there were some things I wanted to improve, which I think we have this past year, and I'm happy to get into that.
Well, let's start with the conflicts of interest disclosures, which is something we were discussing earlier in the show. I know there's some different rules for the Senate and the House as to how lawmakers are supposed to disclose potential conflicts of interest. First, Senator, could you describe what they are in the Senate?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the beginning of the session, we fill out our forms that sort of name what our sources of income are and what investments we might have, and that is published so people can look at it. But there's some caps. If it's under, I believe it's $5,000. For investments, it doesn't need to be disclosed. The amounts that we might be getting don't need to be disclosed. So there is a disclosure process. But under the larger code of ethics, there's not really an enforcement process.
Okay. But say more about that. There's not an enforcement process. So you disclose it, but then no one's really checking up to see if it affects your work?
It is public, so people can look at it. But there is nothing really aside from our Senate rule saying, you can't vote on something if it directly impacts you.
Mm-hmm. It's our job here in the press to
yes,
follow up. Yeah,
exactly.
Mm-hmm. And does this process differ in the House?
So I think Lola did an excellent job of explaining the conflict of interest issues with respect to voting, with respect to advocacy in the House, that individuals are expected to represent their constituents.
Yeah.
Each House member has at least 4,200 constituents. The senators have over 21,000, unless they're two-member districts and such. So if members are not voting, they're not representing those individuals in our representative democracy. That's really the starting point, I believe. So that's why it is very narrow for an individual to be conflicted out of the work in the House, and specifically with respect to votes. That's why it has to be really just that individual. And actually, the only time I've seen it actually be appropriate was earlier this year. With respect to the vote on our Bennington 1 representative, Jonathan Cooper, on whether he would take his seat. And he recused himself under our rules because of a conflict of interest, because it directly related to him. It wasn't part of another broader group. So that's one part. The other part that Senator Vyhovsky talked about is the disclosures. And those are very important, and those are and the disclosures are expanding. And that's very important for transparency for voters to understand what the interests are of those who they're voting for and can make their decisions. So that's kind of a different area of where the conflicts may arise.
Well, speaking of transparency, though, 7 Days reported this spring that the disclosure forms that you both talked about filling out are filled out by hand. There's different forms for the House and the Senate. You fill them out by hand. Then they are scanned and published on two separate web pages as individual files. And then it's left, as you said, for journalism outlets like 7 Days or VT Digger to create more searchable databases for Vermonters who are interested. That shocked me in this good year of 2025, that is the process. Are you either of you aware of any case to, make this a little bit more 21st century?
I am not aware of any movement towards that, although I think it's certainly part of an important larger discussion about increasing transparency and increasing trust in government. I think the other piece around this conflict of interests aspect that to me is really important is that there's really a difference between voting on an issue as part of a 30-member body or 150-member body and chairing a committee or, leading the discussion and setting the agenda. And that to me is not reflected in the rules. It's sort of this one piece around voting, and the other aspects of whether or not you chair a committee or whether or not you're setting the agenda are really not addressed.
So what exactly do you think should change?
I think that we need to suss out what is that core legislative function that is representing our constituents and what is not necessarily. When you're elected to vote and represent your constituents, but you're not necessarily elected to set the agenda and be the chair of a committee. So I think there's some work to be done to sort of suss out what are the nuances of core legislative function.
Representative LaLonde, what do you think? Do you agree?
I do think that additional clarity is needed. Although I do think that advocating for positions on behalf of constituents, which could mean trying to become a chair of a committee or influencing the agenda, I think that's part of what representatives and senators are supposed to do. But we could definitely use some more clarity of when a conflict of interest could come into that situation.
I want to ask you both about something that our previous guest from the State Ethics Committee brought up, which is a vote that happens this past session. Legislators voted to delay for 2 years the implementation of a law that would have made the House and Senate ethics panels consult with the State Ethics Commission when there are allegations of misconduct. She expressed disappointment in that 2-year delay. And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts. Representative?
Yeah, so I think that was an important bill that did pass, H1, and that was something that was supported by the ethics panel in the House. Last year, there was a bill that passed that extended a consultation requirement. That was kind of really secondary as far as what that bill did. It really focused on municipal ethics code and other areas, the disclosures, and that we didn't really get to understand that was there until last summer after the law was in place. And our legislative counsel, who staff our committee, explained that there was an issue as far as the consultation requirement was impinging on our exclusive prerogative to look at the qualifications of our members, that there was a separation of power issue, and there were some other issues. So what we did is we changed what the consultation requirement is. And there's a separate thing we're talking about is the investigatory process of the commission. But as far as the consultation, what is required under this law that just passed is that when there is a complaint that comes to the commission, it's referred, and it involves a legislator. It's referred either to the Senate or the House Ethics Panel. And we ask at that time that the commission points out what parts of the code of ethics are alleged to be violated. So we want to understand from them what they think as far as what are the allegations addressing, and also a recommendation to the extent they can give us a recommendation. So we're asking for that up front as opposed to putting a delay on our deliberations on how to deal with an ethics violation. Now, the investigatory part, which is delayed until 27, that, from what I understand, was really a budget issue and not having enough funds to staff everything that all the requests that we had throughout the government. That was my understanding.
Why would that involve it would involve a new staff member to? It's
my understanding they need to have additional staff, including somebody who is a licensed lawyer, I think, to be able to interpret the laws as well.
I understand. And Senator Vyhovsky.
Absolutely. So as vice chair of the Senate Government Operations Committee, we spent a lot of time with H1, and I share the executive director's disappointment with H1. I voted no on that, as I think it's actually a pretty monumental step backwards in government transparency. There was quite a contentious debate between our parliamentarians and constitutional experts in Vermont as to whether or not the consultation requirement actually did pose a constitutional problem, given that it did not extend the ability for the Ethics Commission to do anything. It was simply a consultation requirement on things that are not core legislative functions. And so that would be things outside of what the legislature sort of polices itself on. So there was quite a debate as to whether or not it actually was unconstitutional. And frankly, the Ethics Commission did ask for more positions, and I think it's pretty problematic that we put in place a code of ethics and we stood up an ethics panel, and yet we haven't prioritized actually putting the money into them being able to do their job. You know, the budget is where we lay out our priorities and what's important to us, and the fact that year after year after year we don't properly fund this ethics commission, to me, says that it's not actually that important to us. So I did not vote for H1 because I actually don't. I felt like it was a pretty monumental step backwards.
I saw you nodding there, Representative.
I do agree that it's very important that we properly resource the Ethics Commission, and I am very supportive of that. I was mainly talking about the consultation requirement, and really I felt that the better argument was that this was unconstitutional, that you can't control policy of the legislature through statute was another argument. And I found those to be more persuasive than the other arguments that this was okay. But let me emphasize that I still respect and want to understand from the commission their viewpoint. I anticipate in those instances where we're talking about where they have expertise, such as gift giving and the limits there, that we can. There's nothing that prevents us. In fact, we changed our procedures to specifically provide that we may consult with the commission regarding complaints.
Well, let's table that for just a moment, because I do want to, acknowledge the big ethics case in recent memory out of the State House, which was the bag soaking scandal involving Representative Mary Morrissey, who repeatedly poured water in the bag of Representative Jim Carroll following some personal disputes that they had. That led lawmakers to tweak the rules about how much the ethics panel can describe its work to the public and to the press. The panel now has to issue public reports on each of its investigations. I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on that change, and if you think it is a step forward for transparency. Representative, we'll start with you since that was a House case.
Yes, and that's certainly something I was behind. This is my third session chairing the panel, and as I started to understand the panel's work, and one of my biggest concerns was transparency, that it really was a black box. And that really became apparent last summer with the complaint that you mentioned. And we worked during the summer, the panel, to come up with some ways that we could improve our transparency. And the two main, there's a few things it does, but I'll explain the two main ones. One is if a complaint becomes public, which that one did, our rules then really prevented us from saying anything. And we wanted to be able to, if there's a complaint, an issue that is public, we want to give the panel an ability to comment, to say, here's what we're doing about this, to give some satisfaction that it's not being addressed.
Right.
The other is when a complaint is closed, and it can be closed for a number of reasons. And last year, that complaint was closed, even though we found that there was a reason to believe there was an ethical violation. But that went to a stipulation and a restorative justice process that involved both representatives. That can be seen in a joint press release that they released. But we want to be able to explain, what was the complaint and how did we close it? And those are for the complaints that don't go all the way to a hearing and to a resolution that seeks censure or reprimand or expulsion of a member. So I think this is a very important step. We'll see how it goes. I will continue to monitor and see if there's more we can do as far as transparency to show the work that we're doing.
Thank you. And Senator Vyhovsky, what do you think of the closed-door nature of ethics deliberations and some of these changes that have been implemented?
Yeah, well, so first I want to be clear that those changes were made in the House. They actually haven't been mirrored in the Senate. I hope to work over the off session on a resolution to work on in the Senate and on the Senate ethics panels to update our rules as well. This is something I came into the biennium thinking about, and then this year was a little chaotic, and I lost sight of it a little bit.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah. And I do think that there is, we have to balance the transparency, and I agree with Representative LaLonde that there are definitely spaces where we have to build that transparency where it doesn't exist. But I also know that sometimes ethics complaints are used because you're frustrated with someone, and so I also understand why there's a space where keeping it quiet makes sense, but I do think we need to increase transparency and increase the way we're reporting on what's coming in.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that there are situations in which a person's character could be kind of inaccurately slandered because of kind of a personal issue between two people.
And because of the nature of the job, that could become very public.
Yes. Do you think that happens often?
I don't know that it happens often, but I certainly think that it can and does happen.
Representative, how big of an issue is this?
I don't think that's a huge issue. I think most of the complaints that we're seeing have some legitimate concern, but we have to weigh those against due process of the individual representative and the First Amendment. Just because you become a legislator doesn't mean that your First Amendment and other constitutional rights go away. So oftentimes it may be somebody upset about what somebody has said, but that's an important thing that we have to look at.
Mm-hmm. Well, we here at Vermont Public try to remain impartial on most things, but we are big fans of the First Amendment. So here to that. Senator Tanya Vyhovsky is on the Senate Ethics Panel and the Government Operations Committee. Senator, thank you so much for joining us on Vermont Edition.
Thank you for having me and for having this important conversation.
We are also joined by Representative Martin LaLonde. He's a Democrat from South Burlington and the chair of the House Ethics Committee and the House Judiciary Committee. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, that is all the time that we have for this conversation today. Thank you for everyone who wrote in and helped us wrestle with this complex topic. It's surely one that we'll return to, especially when the next session starts back up in January. Today's show was directed by Aaliyah Papes. John Ahrens is our managing producer. Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro are our producers. Our intern is Callie Canuxerl. Today's call screener was Kelly Delorier, and our theme music is by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch up again soon.
These days, there's so much news, it can be hard to keep up with what it all means for you, your family, and your community. The Consider This podcast from NPR features our award-winning journalism. 6 days a week, we bring you a deep dive on a news story and provide the context and analysis that helps you make sense of the news. We get behind the headlines. We get to the truth. Listen to the Consider This podcast from NPR.